Hello everyone and welcome back to a brand new video and welcome back to Automobilista 2. Yes, we've returned today, continuing through our step through history. This time around we stop in the 1980s. Of course, if you missed out on the video last week, where we took 1970s Formula 1 cars to the classic version of the Nürburgring, I would highly recommend going back and checking it out. But today, yeah, like I said, we're making a little bit step closer towards modern Formula 1. The 1980s, I think, was a really kind of transformative generation in, F1. You kind of started the decade with the sport kind of still being very dangerous coming out of the 1970s, but already, the likes of Niki Lauda and others were kind of being very vocal still about the changes that needed to be made in the sport. And of course, by the time we got towards the end of the 80s, Formula 1 had kind of now taken shape into something we recognise in this day and age, with a couple of noticeable twists. We're going to be doing some racing around a couple of interesting circuits. I think we're going to head to Adelaide, though, to do a couple of laps in the game. Because, of course, the 1980s as well in Formula 1 was known for the generation called the original turbo generation cars. As you can see, the Formula Classic Gen 1 model is probably one of the best examples in this game. This first car has got a 1.5 litre V6 engine producing 1200 horsepower, but I think for our little practice run today, we're going to take on the Model 2, because with a 4-cylinder inline engine, 1.5 litres, this thing produces 1300 horsepower in kind of its qualifying setup mode. Obviously, these cars are kind of based, on when Formula 1 cars, they would bring engines literally to run 3 laps in qualifying before they'd blow up. It was pretty wild, and it cost a lot of money to kind of keep engine programs going, but to gain any extra performance, I mean, this thing has a theoretical top speed of 400 kilometers an hour, which is just insane. Get yourself subscribed if you're new. Obviously, we're going to be continuing on. We've got V10 cars coming very soon throughout the late 90s and into 2000s. But yeah, this one I think is going to be a good one. Well, I don't believe I've ever driven this car inside this game, so it is certainly going to be a very interesting one then. Of course, let's immediately hear what a 4-cylinder 1300 horsepower car sounds like. I've got to get it up into the power band. Pretty good, I would argue. I mean, you've basically just got to try and get it up over 9,000 RPM, or yeah, it starts picking up just before then, I guess. But for our kind of little early laps, we've come back to the 1988 version of the Adelaide Formula 1 circuit, of course. Obviously, Albert Park, Australia, in just a couple of weeks' time, but this was obviously the Australian Grand Prix. Whoa! This was the Australian Grand Prix before Albert Park, as immediately I've gone and done big damage. Right, well, next time out then, I've now gone and turned the boost pressure up right to the max, because even then, we were only running 55% boost pressure on this car. I mean, it feels like it's got very little in terms of kind of, braking performance. As, I mean, look at that, it just immediately, you are straight up towards the red line in this thing. Big curves around this circuit. I mean, this thing's just undrivable, surely. Again, it's this kind of, like I said, this Formula 1 in the 1980s is really oddly split, kind of between the first half of the decade, which still feels very kind of old school and kind of raw, and then the second half of the decade where things had started to become a bit more sophisticated inside the sport. But driving this car, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it just will not go in a straight line. What on earth is this? Well, like I said, when we head into a race, I think we're going to try and do it in kind of one of the slightly more modern cars that maybe has got not quite as a ridiculous kind of top power figure inside this game, but I mean, you just get it anywhere near anything. I'd like to actually just get a lap of Adelaide done at some point in this challenge, but we'll wait and see how long that takes me as through these first couple of corners, the concentration required is just ridiculous. I mean, the turbo bar, obviously it's on the dash as well. You can see when you kind of get up into the range, just how much immediately the boost pressure climbs up then. But yeah, like I was trying to say originally, obviously this was the original version of the Adelaide Formula 1 circuit. Of course, they do still use Adelaide, I believe. Oh. I mean, if it just goes round, you've basically just got to try and just hang on to it as best as you can. But yeah, they still obviously use Adelaide for things like the Australian Supercar Series and things like that. It is still kind of up there as one of their crown jewel events still inside the series. As there we go. There goes at 200 miles an hour down the back straight. Pops and bangs as well. But obviously, yeah, this circuit probably, it's basically in Formula 1 terms kind of known for really two things, isn't it? Obviously, one of those being Michael Schumacher crashing into Damon Hill in the 1994 title decider, if I remember correctly. And then obviously the second one probably being obviously the fact that this was the last circuit that both Alain Prost and Ayrton Senna got a podium, which they shared at the end of 1993 as well. So yeah, certainly obviously a track that, yeah, it doesn't, I mean, you had a couple of other really crazy races here, wet races, things like that. I mean, I managed to just get one lap in there, but already as well, what I think is great with AMS2 is the fact it simulates the engine wear. So obviously, because we've got the boost pressure so high, and because we're not exactly being gentle with it, one lap here has already taken 10% of life out of the engine on the maximum boost pressure. That's actually quite conservative relative to what these cars used to be like IRL. Because like I said, you know, it was always the famous story of the Brabham back in the mid-80s that was apparently producing 1,500 brake horsepower, but the engine would literally last about 2 laps. Let's see how much speed we can pick up then down the back straight once again. As this corner, yeah, very different. In modern times, apparently I can't pick up anything. It's just impossible to drive in a straight line, this car. So I think, like I said, we're gonna head out in one of the other ones. And I think today we're gonna head to the old Hockenheim. Just because, again, Automobilista 2 is the ultimate kind of Formula 1 sandbox, I want to just quickly take this car to the 1970s version of the Hockenheim ring, just because I'm really interested to see what speed we can get out of it. So I've closed up the engine, the engine cooling even, I should say. I've whacked up the turbo as high as it'll go, and I've taken all of the aerodynamics off the car as well then. At what kind of speed can we get out of this thing as we make our way down the back straight? There goes 350 kilometers an hour, and we are immediately at VMAX. That's about 215, I want to say, and it just, I mean, it gets there so stupidly quickly. I don't know if these cars would actually handle like this back in the day, but it's just so ridiculous how quickly this thing reaches that kind of speed. I mean, look at the dash. Obviously, when you get that turbo spooled up properly. As I said, this thing's got a 1.5 litre engine. I mean, there's 180 miles an hour and just immediately pinned back up right at the top. Well, here we are then in a late 1980s Formula 1 car, and now we don't even have to deal with the turbo inside these things. So rather than 1,400 horsepower, we've only got about 600 horsepower to deal with. We're in the classic Gen 2 cars, because although it's a little bit hard to tell with some of the kind of generic content inside AMS2, I believe the Gen 3 and Gen 4 cars are actually based on the early to mid 1990s. So I also decided we'd actually go to Jacaragua. I'm pretty certain I'm butchering the name horrendously, but this hosted the Brazilian Grand Prix for a few years when kind of Interlagos was receiving updates and things like that. So yeah, this was actually the home Grand Prix of Ayrton Senna for a few years, and of course all of the many other Brazilian drivers that we've seen in the sport. But yeah, I've never really done many laps around here in any kind of game in the past, so I thought today we try and give it a go in these classic Gen 2 Formula cars. I'm still so tempted at some point down the line to do kind of a full-on mod career mode or seasons in this game, I should say. Very, very good fun until I did that. Oh, dearie me. We might have just absolutely murdered someone in this race. That was not exactly what I had in mind. But yeah, this circuit, I believe, hosted the Formula 1 season opener on a couple of occasions. I think we're going to do a quick restart, just because we seem to have been a bit disconnected from the pack, and I've beat the car on the curb. Well, I've only just realised as well, there were actually 2 MP4-4s in this split. I don't know if I just haven't got the DLC for them, but I certainly have not had the option to drive the car inside this race, so yeah, I think that'll explain why you might have seen there was one AI that had broken free at the front of the order, but I believe, yeah, you can get like 1988 kind of mods as well for this game, like skin packs and things. So I think a 1988 season would be really cool to do, because it seems to be a year that AMS2 was really focused on. For example, I believe you can get Montreal 1988. I believe there's an early 90s version of Hockenheim as well inside this game. So yeah, really, really cool to see. Is again, slightly misjudging my breaking point there. There's even Monza as well, which I was tempted to drive, but I thought I wanted to take on this circuit for today's videos. I think I've actually taken one guy out of this race then, so that's really not ideal. Brought out the yellow flags a little bit further back. I do apologise to the AI that I've apparently murdered early on in this race. But yeah, like I said, there's a real focus. I think obviously, you know, it was kind of as we got onboard cameras in Formula 1 and things like that, it makes it a lot easier for the team over at Razor to really kind of focus and, you know, provide high enough quality content. I mean, those curbs are just lethal. Absolutely lethal. We tried to set this up as a 5-lap race, but hopefully third time will be the charm then as we make our way back towards someone. I just want to try and go through one of these without just completely wiping someone out very early on, of course. Cold brakes on lap 1. Doesn't take you long to get a little bit of temperature into them, but certainly, yeah, makes things very dicey off the start of this thing. But yeah, I mean, the late 80s, the early 90s was obviously a really cool generation in Formula 1 anyway. Like I said, you kind of come out of the turbos of the mid-80s, you know, where power figures had just become beyond stupid. You know, Formula 1 was definitely making kind of more decisions regarding kind of, or with more decisions focused on driver safety as well. You know, it's why I think a lot more of the tracks as well had, apart from the huge curves, become kind of a lot more sensible and things like that as well. You know, I think by this point there were limits on how long circuits could be and things like that, of course, as well. So Spa then was kind of the longest circuit on the calendar by the late 1980s as well. Of course, we kind of also come out of... It felt like a bit like Formula 1 now, like the mid-1980s. Oh, I can't... No, how does it keep just getting absolutely wedged on that curbing? Come on, we just got to try and finish this race. But yeah, we kind of started to come out of this generation of... It seemingly was mainly in the US, but we got so many street tracks in kind of the mid-80s as well, which Formula 1 had kind of worked out at that point weren't working the way they wanted them to. Sadly, they kind of have forgot that now in the sport, and well, we seem to be getting a street track added well, pretty much every year, it feels like, at the moment still. But yeah, it was really kind of an era of Formula 1 kind of almost, like I said, it's kind of the very early years of Formula 1 starting to modernise itself as well. And I think, you know, having the teams like, you know, obviously Ferrari there since day one, but, you know, McLaren and Williams as well had now truly solidified themselves as top competitors. And really from the 80s onwards, most teams can kind of, you know, showcase their lineage from back in this era as well. Of course, Mercedes going back all the way to, I believe, Tyrrell, I want to say. Obviously, Red Bull as well, with the obviously originally Jaguar, and obviously going back through as well. Trying to test my Formula 1 knowledge whilst driving these cars is always quite scary, especially when I wanted to have a look down the inside. They're down at the end of the back straight. But yeah, this was, like I said, kind of where, Formula 1 that we now know and love was kind of a lot of its roots stem back to the 80s and things like that. So it really was a decade of kind of maturing for Formula 1, and say the difference between the start of the generation and the end of it, wildly different as well. And let's just appreciate as well just how many ridiculously good drivers there were. Formula 1 back in this era was stacked. Obviously, you had Senna and Prost and all their rivalries throughout so many years. You had the likes of Nigel Mansell as well. Obviously, he was finally able to pick up a world championship in the early 90s. Nelson Piquet, of course, not a particularly well-liked man anymore around the motorsport world, but obviously still, he's three-time world champion. Has ultimately still got to be mentioned. Of course, obviously fought for multiple other, things. And, you had towards the end of the generation as well, Jean Alesi bursting onto the scene. Obviously, Schumacher into the early 90s as well. But, you also still have the likes of, Niki Lauda, for example. People often forget that he won his third world championship in 1984. Sorry, 1985 even. So, it was still, kind of, you had some really iconic drivers that were still, showing that they absolutely have what it takes. And I must admit as well, this track, even the background scenery as well, absolutely gorgeous. Razor always do a fantastic job with, all of the tracks, even these classic ones. They still feel very real. They do a very good job of kind of capturing them, I think, inside this game. They feel absolutely of their time. But they still feel really cool there. So I want to try and have a look around the outside, but again, just getting reminded of that huge curve that's caused me so many problems throughout this race, as you'll see as well. I mean, look at that, the AI once again really trying to fight me in towards the corners there, but everybody, flames flying out the back of all these cars as well. So kind of unforgiving still to drive, the engine power figures, they were right up, kind of as you'd expect them to be, but things like the tyre technology, the brakes, the aerodynamics, certainly still, kind of not make, they haven't quite made the same progress as, the engines had by this point in the sport. And of course, come on, try and stay off that curve as best as I can. I can't get over, I mean, this car doesn't, I see it, the aerodynamics wasn't really there. This thing does still feel quite grippy in a lot of places as well, Those tyres were, it was definitely a huge step from the 1970s. Kind of the generation of, sliding the cars through the corner was very much over by the time you got in towards, especially kind of the later of the 1980s. Once the turbo cars were gone, it was a lot more about, trying to keep it a bit more sophisticated and everything like that. So don't go for another spin, please, Matt. We'd actually built up quite a good gap from some of those cars behind, but you get it off of the kind of circuit and it's just got nothing still, as you would expect. I mean, this was also a time, of course, you still had H-pattern gearboxes and, obviously proper clutches and things like that in the late 80s, so it was probably the toughest Formula 1 ever was on a driver's body as well, because you were still having to focus on all of that. And, the cars were getting so quick as well, which obviously does make things far more difficult as well. Than as you can see, even from a 5-lap race here, I am really struggling with this car. So, yeah, big kind of physical workouts as well. And, just so draining. There's obviously that footage of Senna in, I think, 1991, wasn't it, when he won his only Brazilian Grand Prix at Interlagos. Obviously after he lost most of the gears on the car. he was absolutely shattered by the end of that race. And kind of just goes to show how difficult still and how intense Formula 1 was. You know, although you weren't having to deal with these huge turbos and things like that, you know, it was still not an easy kind of car to drive, because once you kind of got rid of the turbos, it felt like you could drive the cars more on the limit, which, you know, maybe not as scary, but arguably just as intense still. But yeah, this circuit, really, really good fun inside this game. And like I said, I could be so tempted to do a 1988 mod career mode at some point down the line, which I think would be really, really good fun to do. But yeah, leader already then has crossed the line. I believe that is fake Alain Prost that has won this one. You can see a few names that you might potentially start to recognise as kind of parody up and down the order, but especially as we move in towards the 90s and the 2000s as well, more and more of those. You guys will definitely be able to see there as I'm trying to look around the outside of a couple of people. Oh, as and where I can. And again, that one curb I could just not do inside this game. Oh, sorry. Maybe I've just rejoined very dangerously against that driver there, Santos, right at the rear of the field. But, I mean, yeah, these things have been such a physical challenge to drive in this one. So it probably hasn't been my best driving in the world. There is again another swap run out of the final corner. Over the line, though, we will go. 49 seconds, 50 seconds behind the leader. Thank you all so much for watching, though. If you have enjoyed, please do make sure you leave a like, get yourself subscribed. And yeah, we'll be back very soon with more Automobilista 2 content.